Rain drummed on the windshield as Detective John Brady parked his tattered Ford outside St. Augustine Catholic Church. The New Orleans night was dark and humid, like most of his cases. Brady sighed, adjusted his wrinkled tie, and stepped out of the car, immediately feeling his boots sink into a puddle. Great start to the shift, he muttered to himself as he headed toward the church where his partner, Detective Mike Fontaine, was already waiting for him. "What do we got, Mike?" Brady asked, climbing the steps. Fontaine, a young detective with a wary look, nodded toward the entrance. The body of a 35-year-old woman was discovered in the confessional. Preliminarily looks like suicide, but you smell something's wrong, Brady finished for him. "Let's go take a look." Inside, the church was filled with flickering candles and the smell of incense. Brady immediately noticed a group of police and forensics officers crowded around the confessional. "Spread out," he commanded, stepping closer. "Let me see." The woman's body sat in the confessional booth, head bowed as if in prayer. An empty pill bottle lay on the floor. Brady leaned over, scrutinizing the corpse. "Mary Ellis, 35 years old," Fontaine reported. "Married, 2 children, parishioner of this church." Brady nodded, not taking his eyes off the body. Something was wrong here, but he couldn't yet figure out what it was. "Who found the body?" he asked. "The priest, Father James," Fontaine replied. "He's in his office right now, giving a statement." Brady straightened up and looked around the church. His gaze stopped on the statue of the Virgin Mary. "Strange place for a suicide, don't you think?" Fontaine shrugged. "Maybe seeking forgiveness?" "Maybe," Brady stretched thoughtfully. "Or maybe she wasn't. Something doesn't add up here, Mike. Look at her hands." Fontaine leaned over and took a closer look. "What's wrong with them?" "No sign of a struggle, no scratches. If she took a lethal dose of pills, there should have been seizures, but her posture is too calm." Brady turned to the CSI, who was just finishing taking photos of the crime scene. "Hey, Johnson, check her for other substances in her blood. Anything that could have caused paralysis." "Will do, boss," the CSI nodded. Brady took another look around the church. "Mike, canvass the congregation. Find out everything you can about Mary Ellis. I'll talk to the priest." Fontaine nodded and headed toward the group of people crowded around the entrance to the church. Brady, on the other hand, walked toward the priest's office. Father James appeared to be a tall black man in his mid-40s. He sat at his desk, nervously going over his rosary beads. "Detective Brady," John introduced himself. "Tell us how you discovered the body." The priest took a deep breath. "Yeah, I was holding an evening service. I usually spend time in prayer afterward. When I approached the confessional, I saw Mary." "Did you know Mrs. Ellis well?" Brady asked, watching the priest's reaction carefully. "She was a parishioner of our church for many years," replied Father James. "An exemplary wife and mother. Yeah, I can't believe she could—" His voice shook, and he fell silent. Brady noticed the white knuckles of the priest's fingers clutching the rosary beads. "Father James, have you noticed anything unusual in Mrs. Ellis's behavior lately?" The priest shook his head. "No, nothing. She's been the same as always." Brady nodded, making notes in his notebook. "Thank you, Father. If you remember anything else, please let us know." Walking out of the office, the detective faced Fontaine. "What did you find out?" Brady asked. "Nothing much," shrugged Fontaine. "Everyone says the same thing. Model wife, caring mother, active parishioner. No problems, no oddities." Brady rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Too perfect, don't you think? What about the husband?" "Tom Ellis," Fontaine replied. "Works as an accountant. He's at home with the kids right now. I've sent uniforms to bring him in for questioning." "Good." Brady nodded. "Let's go to the station and we'll question him there." On the way to the police station, Brady was silent, immersed in his thoughts. Something about this case kept him uneasy. It was too smooth, too right. And he had learned one rule in his years on the force. If something seemed too good to be true, it was. Tom Ellis was already waiting for them at the station, a lean man in his 40s with disheveled hair and eyes red from crying. "Mr. Ellis," Brady began, sitting down across from him in the interrogation room. "I'm very sorry for your loss, but we need to ask you some questions." Tom nodded, nervously rubbing his wedding ring. Yeah, I understand. Ask away. Where were you tonight between 7 and 9 o'clock? Tom blinked. Yeah, I was at home. With the kids. We were watching a movie. Can anyone confirm that? Fontaine asked. Just the kids, replied Tom. They're 8 and 10 years old. Brady glanced over to Fontaine. Not the most reliable alibi. Mr. Ellis, have you noticed anything unusual in your wife's behavior lately? Tom shook his head. No, nothing. Mary was just like she always has been. Taking care of the kids, going to church. I don't understand how this could have happened. And how did your relationship work out? Weren't there any problems? Fights? Tom shuddered. No, there weren't. We had a wonderful marriage. We loved each other. Brady looked at the man carefully. The man was clearly nervous, but that could be put down to the shock of losing his wife. Mr. Ellis, did you know your wife was on any medication? Medication? Tom looked genuinely surprised. No, nothing like that. Except the occasional aspirin for headaches. Brady nodded. Thank you, Mr. Ellis. That's all for now, but please don't leave town. We may need to ask you some more questions. When Tom left, Brady turned to Fontaine. What do you think? I don't know. The young detective shook his head. Seems genuinely concerned, but something's not right here. Exactly, Brady agreed. Something's definitely wrong here. Check his alibi, weak though it may be. Talk to the neighbors, see if anyone saw or heard anything. Fontaine nodded and left the room. Brady was left alone, staring wistfully out the window at the nighttime New Orleans. The rain was still pouring down like a bucket, as if trying to wash away all the sins of this city. What happened to you, Mary Ellis? He muttered under his breath. And whose fault is it? Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was Sarah Chen, the CSI. Detective Brady, I have the preliminary toxicology results, she said, holding out a folder. Brady quickly ran his eyes over the report and frowned. No traces of sleeping pills or other potent drugs? How is that possible? Sarah shrugged. I don't know yet, but there's something else. We found traces of semen on the victim's underwear. Brady raised an eyebrow. So our model housewife had secrets after all. Do a DNA test and compare it to the husband's sample. Already doing it, Sarah nodded. We'll have the results in the morning. Great, Brady rubbed his tired eyes. We'll visit the church again tomorrow morning. Something tells me we haven't learned everything about Mary Ellis's life yet. Sarah left, and Brady sat at his desk for another long time, poring over the facts. An exemplary wife and mother, no visible problems, yet signs of recent sexual intercourse. No sign of drugs or medication, but a posture uncharacteristic of natural death. And that church. Why there? The detective felt that the answers to all of these questions were somewhere close by. All he had to do was connect the dots. But now, at 3 in the morning, his brain refused to work. Mornings are wiser, he muttered, turning off the lights in his office and heading for the exit. Tomorrow would be a new day, and he would be sure to solve this mystery. After all, the dead deserve justice just as much as the living. The morning greeted Detective John Brady with frowning skies and drizzling rain. He parked his car outside St. Augustine's Church, where Mary Ellis's body had been found yesterday. The building looked even more somber today than it had the day before. Brady went inside, where a tall black man in a soutane was already waiting for him. Detective Brady, the man held out his hand. I'm Father James, the priest of this church. Brady shook the outstretched hand, noting to himself that the priest's palm was cold and slightly damp. Father James, I'd like to ask you a few questions about Mary Ellis. The priest nodded, his face taking on a mournful expression. Of course, Detective. Mary's death is a terrible tragedy for our entire parish. She was a wonderful person. Brady noticed how Father James's voice trembled at the last words. Did you know Mrs. Ellis well? She was an active parishioner, the priest replied. Attended services regularly, participated in charity events. Mary was a light to our congregation. Brady watched Father James carefully. The priest looked genuinely saddened, but something in his demeanor alarmed the detective. Father James, have you noticed anything unusual in Mary's behavior lately? The priest thought for a moment. No, nothing in particular. Although, she may have started coming to confession more often, but I can't reveal the content of our conversations. Brady nodded. I see. And aside from confessions, did you have much contact with Mary? Only as part of church activities, Father James replied. Detective, if it helps the investigation, I'm willing to provide any information that doesn't violate the secrecy of confession. Brady noted to himself this willingness to help. Thank you, Father James. We'll be sure to contact you if we need more information. Leaving the church, Brady headed for the police station. There, CSI Sarah Chen was already waiting for him with a folder in her hands. Detective, I have something interesting, she said as soon as Brady entered the office. I'm all ears, Sarah. I was able to recover the deleted messages from Mary Ellis's cell phone. Sarah opened the folder. And here's what I found. She held out several printouts to Brady. The detective quickly ran his eyes over the text and whistled. Are these definitely from Mary's phone? He asked. Sarah nodded. Yes, no doubt about it. The messages have been sent and received for the last 2 months. Brady scrutinized the texts. The messages were short, but their content left no doubt. Mary Ellis was seeing someone in secret. A lover? Brady suggested. Looks like it, agreed Sarah. But here's the weird thing. The number the messages came from is registered to a prepaid card. There's no way to trace the owner. Brady rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Someone really didn't want their identity revealed. Sarah, can you determine where these messages were sent from? The forensic scientist shook her head. Unfortunately, no, but I did notice one pattern. Most of the appointments were made during church services. Brady raised an eyebrow. Interesting. It seems our model housewife was using the church as a cover for her secret meetings. What do we do next, Detective? Sarah asked. Brady stood up and headed for the door. I'm going to have another talk with Mary's husband, and then I think we should pay another visit to James's father. I have some new questions for our priest. As he left the office, Brady felt the case growing more and more confusing. Who was Mary Ellis's secret lover? And what did it have to do with her death? Detective John Brady sat at his desk, reviewing the DNA results that Sarah Chen had just brought in. He rubbed his tired eyes and reread the conclusion once again. No way, he muttered. At that moment, Mike Fontaine, his partner, entered the office. What is it, boss? He asked, nodding at the papers in Brady's hands. Tom Ellis's DNA, Brady replied. It matches the samples found on Mary's body. Fontaine whistled. So the husband is involved after all? Brady shook his head thoughtfully. Don't jump to conclusions. Yes, his DNA is there, but that doesn't prove anything yet. They were husband and wife after all. But it's something, Fontaine objected. We have a motive, Mary's possible infidelity. We have his DNA on the body, and he has no alibi for the time of the murder. Brady sighed. You're right, Mike. That's enough for an arrest. Let's go to the Ellises. Half an hour later, they were already standing in front of the door of the Ellis family home. Brady knocked, and a few seconds later, the door was opened by Tom. Detective Brady, he said in surprise. Is something wrong? Mr. Ellis, Brady began in an official tone. You're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of your wife, Mary Ellis. Tom's eyes widened with shock. What? No, there's some mistake. I didn't kill Mary. You have the right to remain silent, Brady continued, handcuffing Tom. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Fontaine put Tom into the police car, Brady noticed an elderly woman watching them from behind the curtain of a neighboring house. He made a mental note to talk to the neighbors later. At the station, Tom Ellis sat in the interrogation room, his hands shaking and a look of horror and disbelief frozen on his face. Mr. Ellis, Brady began, sitting down across from him. Tell us what happened the night your wife died. Tom shook his head. I've already told you. I was at home with the kids. We were watching a movie. And you never once left the house? Fontaine asked. No, Tom exclaimed. I swear I didn't leave the house that night. Brady leaned forward. Mr. Ellis, we found your DNA on your wife's body. How do you explain that? Tom turned pale. I don't know. We were married, Detective. Of course, my DNA could have been on her. When was the last time you were intimate with your wife? Brady asked. The morning of that day, Tom answered after a pause. Before I left for work. Brady and Fontaine glanced over. That might explain the presence of the DNA. Mr. Ellis, Brady continued, were you having problems in your marriage? Maybe you suspected your wife of cheating? Tom shuddered. No, we had a wonderful marriage. She would never. At that moment, Sarah Chen entered the room. Detective Brady, can I talk to you for a minute? Brady stepped out into the hallway. What is it, Sarah? I have the results of a more detailed analysis, she said, holding out a new report to him. Tom Ellis's DNA is indeed present on the body, but there's something else. We found traces of other DNA that doesn't match either Tom or Mary. Brady frowned. So there was a third person. He returned to the interrogation room with the new information. Mr. Ellis, it seems there was someone else with your wife that night. Is there anything you want to tell us? Tom looked confused. Yep, I don't understand. Someone else? Suddenly, an agitated officer burst into the office. Detective Brady, there's a call on the hotline. An anonymous witness claims to have information about the murder of Mary Ellis. Brady walked out quickly, leaving Fontaine with Tom. He picked up the phone and heard a trembling female voice. Yeah, I know who killed Mary Ellis, the woman said. It was a priest, Father James. They were having an affair. Brady tensed. How do you know that? I saw them together, the woman replied. Several times. They met in the park near the church. I live in the house across the street and often walk my dog there. Can you describe exactly what you saw? Brady asked. They were kissing, holding hands, it was obvious. Why did you decide to call just now? A pause. Yeah, I was afraid. Father James is a respected man in our neighborhood, but when I heard that Mary's husband had been arrested, I couldn't keep quiet. Brady thanked the woman for the information and hung up. His thoughts were working feverishly. If this was true, the whole affair was taking a completely different turn. He returned to the interrogation room. Mr. Ellis, you're free to go. I apologize for the inconvenience. Tom looked stunned. But what happened? We have some new information, Brady replied briefly. We'll contact you if we need further assistance. As Tom walked away, Fontaine turned to Brady. Boss, what's going on? Brady sighed heavily. Mike, it looks like we missed something very important. Call the church. We need to talk to Father James again. On the way to St. Augustine's church, Brady mentally went over all the facts of the case. How could he have missed such an important detail? An affair with a priest would explain so much. Mary's frequent visits to the church, her strange behavior in recent weeks, even her choice of a place to die. When they arrived, Father James met them at the entrance. He looked tense. Detective Brady, he said, what can I do for you? Father James, Brady began, we need to talk about your relationship with Mary Ellis. The priest turned pale. I don't know what you mean. We have a witness who saw you two together, Brady said, in unequivocal situations. Father James closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, his gaze read a mixture of fear and determination. Let's go into my office, he said quietly. In the office, the priest sank heavily into a chair. Yes, we had a relationship with Mary. I know it was a sin, that I broke my vows, but I loved her. Brady looked at him carefully. What happened the night she died? We were supposed to meet at the church after the evening service, Father James answered. But when I arrived, she was was dead. And you didn't call the police right away? Fontaine asked. The priest shook his head. I panicked. I knew how it would look, so I tried to make it look like suicide. Brady felt anger rising inside him. Do you realize you're the prime suspect now? I didn't kill her, Father James exclaimed. By all that is holy, I loved Mary. I would never have harmed her. Then who did? Brady asked. Who else knew about your relationship? The priest hesitated. I'm not sure. We've been very careful, but... But? Brady interjected. There was one man, Father James said slowly. Michael, our young minister, he's been acting strange sometimes lately, especially when Mary was around. Brady and Fontaine glanced over, a new twist in the case. We need to talk to this Michael guy, Brady said. Where can we find him? He should be here at the church, Father James replied. He usually helps with the cleaning in the evenings. They found Michael in the main hall of the church. The young man was wiping down the pews and was visibly nervous when he saw the detectives. Michael? Brady addressed him. We'd like to ask you some questions about the night Mary Ellis died. The young man turned pale. I don't know anything. I wasn't here that night. Really? Brady asked. And Father James says you usually help with the cleaning in the evenings. Michael began to visibly shiver. Michael, Brady said softly, if you've seen or heard something, now would be a good time to tell me. The young man swallowed. I saw them together. Father James and Mrs. Ellis. They were kissing in the sacristy. I didn't mean to peek. I just happened to see it. Brady nodded. What else do you know, Michael? I heard them arguing that night, Michael said quietly. Mrs. Ellis was screaming that she couldn't live like that anymore, that she wanted to tell her husband everything, and Father James begged her not to. Brady felt Fontaine tense beside him. What happened next? I got scared and ran away, Michael answered. And the next morning I found out that Mrs. Ellis was dead. Brady looked at the young man carefully. Michael, why didn't you tell me about this sooner? I was afraid, the young man whispered. Father James, he's always been good to me. I didn't want to believe he could. Brady put a hand on Michael's shoulder. Thank you for your honesty. We'll need to record your statement officially. As they walked out of the church, Fontaine turned to Brady. What do you think, boss? Brady rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I think we're just beginning to unravel this tangle, Mike. Father James is clearly hiding something, but I'm not convinced he's the killer. What about Michael's testimony? Fontaine asked. They're important, agreed Brady, but we need more evidence. Detective John Brady sat at his desk, immersed in studying the documents. After his conversation with Michael, he'd decided to dig deeper into Father James's past, and what he discovered made him frown. Hey, Mike, he called out to his partner. You won't believe what I found. Fontaine walked over to Brady's desk. What is it, boss? Looks like our Father James isn't as saintly as he wants to appear. Brady handed Fontaine a folder. 3 years ago, he was involved in a scandal at his previous parish in Chicago. Fontaine ran his eyes quickly over the documents. Accusations of embezzlement of church funds? Seriously? Brady nodded. Officially, the case was hushed up, but it was quickly transferred here to New Orleans. Seems the church wanted to avoid publicity. Do you think it had something to do with the Mary Ellis murder? Fontaine asked. I don't know, answered Brady, but it certainly casts a shadow on Father James's reputation. Maybe Mary found out about his past and threatened to reveal the truth? A motive for murder? Fontaine suggested. Perhaps. Brady stood up. Let's go visit our priest again. When they arrived at St. Augustine's church, Father James greeted them with obvious concern. Detectives, he said. What can I do for you? Father James, Brady began. We'd like to talk about your background in Chicago. The priest's face went pale. I don't see what this has to do with Mary's death. Maybe none, Brady replied. Or maybe most directly, tell us about the church money scandal. Father James sighed heavily. It was a misunderstanding. I never took a dime from the church treasury, but one of the parishioners made false accusations and instead of investigating the matter, the church just transferred you here? Fontaine interrupted him. It was the diocese's decision, the priest replied quietly. I simply obeyed it. Brady looked at Father James intently. Did Mary know about it? No, the priest answered too quickly. I don't think so. We never discussed my past. Father James, Brady stepped forward. Are you sure you're telling us the whole truth? Because right now you're the prime suspect in the murder of Mary Ellis. The priest opened his mouth to answer, but at that moment a woman burst into the church. She looked like Mary Ellis, only older and with sharper facial features. "Stop!" she shouted. "Don't you dare accuse him! I'm the one who killed Mary!" Brady and Fontaine exchanged surprised glances. "And who are you?" Brady asked. "I'm Sarah Donovan, Mary's sister," replied the woman. She was breathing heavily, as if she'd run several blocks. "And I'm the one who killed her, to save her soul." A heavy silence hung in the room. Father James looked at Sarah with horror, Brady with disbelief. "Mrs. Donovan," the detective said slowly, "do you realize what you just said?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, detective. I confess to the murder of my sister, Mary Ellis." Brady gestured to Fontaine to call for backup. "All right, Mrs. Donovan, let's sit down and you can tell us everything in order." They settled into Father James's office. Sarah sat, nervously rubbing the edge of her blouse. "I found out about Mary's affair with Father James by accident," she began. "Saw them together in the park. They were kissing like teenagers." Father James lowered his head but said nothing. "I was shocked," Sarah continued. "Mary had always been a model wife, a model mother, and suddenly, this. I tried to talk to her, to convince her to end the relationship, but she wouldn't listen." "And you decided to kill her?" Brady asked. Sarah shook her head. "Not right away. I prayed, asked God to set her straight, but nothing changed. And then I found out that Mary was going to leave her husband and children for him." She cast an angry glance at James's father. "How did you find that out?" Fontaine asked. "Mary told me herself," Sarah replied. "She came to me, all glowing, and told me that she had finally found true love, that she was going to start a new life with Father James." Brady looked at the priest. He sat with his head down and seemed to have grown even paler. "What happened next, Mrs. Donovan?" the detective asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "I realized I had to do something. For Mary's children. For her soul. I went to church that night. Knew Mary would be there. I wanted to talk to her again, to convince her to come to her senses. But the conversation didn't go well?" Brady suggested. "Mary was stubborn." Sarah clenched her fists. "She said she loved Father James, that it was God's will. I couldn't take it. Grabbed the candlestick and..." She fell silent, covering her face with her hands. Brady and Fontaine looked over at each other. "Mrs. Donovan," Brady said softly, "you do realize that this is a confession to murder?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, detective. I'm willing to be punished, but I did it to save Mary's soul, so she wouldn't commit an irreparable sin." Brady sighed. "Sarah Donovan, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Mary Ellis. You have the right to remain silent." As Fontaine read Sarah her rights, Brady turned to Father James. "And for you, Father, I suggest you get a good lawyer. You'll get in trouble for withholding information about a crime." The priest nodded without raising his eyes. I understand, detective." As Sarah was led away and Father James remained in his office under the watchful eye of the arriving officers, Brady stepped outside. He took a deep breath of the cool evening air. "What do you think, boss?" Fontaine asked as he approached. Brady shook his head. "I don't know, Mike. That confession, it's too convenient. It's too timely." "You think she's lying?" Fontaine wondered. "Probably," answered Brady. "Or at least she's not telling the whole truth. Something doesn't add up here." "But we have a confession," remarked Fontaine. "The prosecutor will be pleased." Brady frowned. "Maybe, but our job is to find the truth, not just close the case. And I feel like we haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet." "What do we do next?" Fontaine asked. "We check Sarah's alibi for the night of the murder," Brady replied. "And talk to Michael again, that young servant. I have a feeling he knows more than he's told us." Fontaine nodded. "All right, boss. I'll look into Sarah's alibi." "Great," Brady said. "In the meantime, I'll check the church's financial records again. See if I can find a connection between the scandal in Chicago and the current situation." When Fontaine left, Brady took another look at the church. The sun was setting, and long shadows lay across the ancient building, giving it an ominous appearance. The detective couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of this church held many more secrets, and he was determined to uncover them all. The next morning, Brady sat at his desk, absorbed in studying the financial records of St. Augustine's. He was looking for any inconsistencies, any strange transactions that might shed some light on the situation. "Hey, boss." Fontaine entered the office. "I've got an update on Sarah Donovan's alibi." Brady tore himself away from the papers. "I'm listening." "It doesn't check out," Fontaine said. "Sarah claims she was home the night of the murder, but neighbors say they saw her leave around the time Mary was killed." Brady rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Interesting. That might corroborate her story, or she's lying," Fontaine finished for him. "Exactly," Brady nodded. "Anything else?" "Yes." Fontaine pulled out a notepad. "I talked to Sarah's co-workers. Turns out she's been acting strange lately. She's been irritable, leaving work early a lot. Could be related to the situation with her sister," Brady suggested. "Possibly," Fontaine agreed. "But there's something else. A co-worker mentioned seeing Sarah in the company of some man. The description sounds like James's father." Brady raised an eyebrow. "Now that's interesting. Looks like our Sarah isn't as simple as she wants to seem either." At that moment the phone rang. Brady picked up the receiver. "Detective Brady here." "Detective." It was Sarah Chen, the forensic scientist. "I have the results of the analysis of the candlestick that was supposedly used to kill Mary Ellis." "And what's in it?" Brady asked. "There are fingerprints on it," replied Sarah, "but they don't belong to Sarah Donovan or Father James." Brady straightened in his chair. "Whose are they then?" "We're still checking through the database," Sarah said, "but there's something else. There are traces of two people's blood on the candlestick." "Mary and the killers?" Brady suggested. "No," replied Sarah. "Mary and Michael, that young servant." Brady felt a chill run down his spine. "Thank you, Sarah. You did good." He hung up the phone and turned to Fontaine. "Mike, we need to find Michael right away. He seems to be involved in this case a lot more than we thought." Brady stood in front of the evidence board, trying to connect all the dots. Something was keeping him on edge. Sarah's confession, Michael's fingerprints on the murder weapon, James's father's secrecy. It was all adding up to a strange picture. "Boss," Fontaine entered the office. "We found Michael. He's in the interrogation room." Brady nodded. "Good. Let's go talk to him." In the interrogation room, Michael sat nervously rubbing the sleeve of his shirt. When he saw the detectives, he flinched. "Michael," Brady began, sitting down across from him, "we found your prints on the murder weapon. Is there anything you want to tell us?" The young man turned pale. "Yeah, I don't understand. What prints?" "On the candlestick used to kill Mary Ellis," Brady answered. "And there was also your blood there. How do you explain that?" Michael began to tremble. I didn't kill her. I swear." "Then tell me what happened," Brady said softly. Michael took a deep breath. "Yeah, I was in the church that night, heard screams and went to look, saw Mrs. Ellis on the floor and the candlestick next to her. I picked it up without thinking, then I got scared and ran away." "And you didn't call the police?" Fontaine asked. Michael shook his head. "I panicked. I knew about Father James and Mrs. Ellis's affair. I thought if I told, I'd let Father James down." Brady looked at the young man carefully. "Michael, why is it so important to you to protect Father James?" Michael lowered his eyes. He's been good to me, when no one else has been." "You're in love with him, aren't you?" Brady asked quietly. Michael flinched and looked up. There were tears in his eyes. How did you know?" "It was obvious," Brady replied. "Your reaction to Father James and Mary's affair, your desire to protect him at all costs." Michael covered his face with his hands. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." At that moment, the door of the interrogation room swung open. Standing on the threshold was Sarah Donovan. "Stop!" she shouted. "Don't torture him! I'm the one who killed Mary!" Brady stood up. "Mrs. Donovan, we've already heard your confession, but the facts say otherwise." Sarah walked over to Michael and put her hand on his shoulder. "Please, detective. I've done this. Michael is innocent." Suddenly, Brady realized. He looked at Sarah, then at Michael, and everything fell into place. "He's your son, isn't he?" the detective asked quietly. A heavy silence hung in the room. Michael lifted his head and looked at Sarah with wide eyes. Sarah sighed heavily. Yes, Michael is my son. I gave birth to him very young and gave him up for adoption, but then I found him and tried to be there for him without revealing the truth. Brady shook his head. And so you're trying to take the blame, to protect him. Yes, Sarah whispered, but I was really there that night. I went to talk to Mary about her affair with Father James, but when I got there, she was already dead, and Michael was standing over her with a candlestick in his hands. Michael jumped up. No, I didn't kill her. I just found her there. Brady raised his hand, calling for everyone to calm down. Let's all calm down and figure this out. Michael, tell us the truth. What really happened that night? Michael sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped. I was really in love with James's father. When I found out about his affair with Mrs. Ellis, I was furious. I went to the church to talk to her to convince her to leave Father James alone. But she laughed in my face. Said I was a silly boy and didn't know anything about love. So I got angry, and I grabbed the candlestick and I hit her. Sarah let out a quiet groan. Brady looked at Michael with sympathy. What happened next? The detective asked. I panicked, Michael continued. Wanted to call an ambulance, but it was too late. And then she came. He nodded toward Sarah. Said she'd help me, that she'd straighten everything out. Brady turned to Sarah. And you decided to take the blame? Sarah nodded. I had just found my son. I couldn't let his life be ruined. And Father James? Fontaine asked. Did he know the truth? No, Michael replied. We didn't tell him anything. I thought if he found out, he'd hate me. Brady sighed heavily. Michael Rodriguez, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Mary Ellis. You have the right to remain silent. As Fontaine read Michael his rights, Brady turned to Sarah. Mrs. Donovan, you're under arrest as well, for obstruction of justice and perjury. As both were led away, Brady was left alone in the interrogation room. He felt a heaviness in his chest. Another tragedy, another family destroyed, all because of secrets and innuendo. Later, sitting in his office, Brady pondered the complexity of human relationships. Michael, who fell in love with a priest and killed out of jealousy. Sarah, who tried to protect the son she had once abandoned. Father James, who broke his vows for love. And Mary, victimized by this tangle of feelings and secrets. The phone rang. It was Sarah Chen. Detective, she said, I have the final test results. Everything confirms Michael's version of events. His DNA on the candlestick. Signs of a struggle on Mary's body. Thank you, Sarah, Brady replied. Good work. He hung up and looked at the picture of Mary Ellis on the evidence board. A beautiful woman with kind eyes. She didn't deserve this fate. There was a knock on the door. It was Fontaine. Boss, he said, the diocese has issued a statement. Father James is suspended from ministry pending an investigation. Brady nodded. Thanks, Mike. Good work today. Fontaine was quiet for a moment, then asked, What do you think, boss? Was it worth it? All the secrets, the lies? Maybe if they'd just been honest with each other from the beginning? Brady sighed. Who knows, Mike? People often think they're protecting their loved ones by hiding the truth. But those secrets end up ruining everything around them. He stood up and walked over to the window. The sun was setting, coloring the New Orleans sky with red and gold hues. You know, Mike, Brady continued, sometimes I think our job isn't so much to catch criminals as it is to solve mysteries, to show people the price they pay for their secrecy. Fontaine nodded. Maybe that's the point, boss. Maybe at least someone will learn from those mistakes. Brady smiled. Maybe, Mike, maybe. He looked at Mary's picture one more time, then started pulling evidence off the board. The case was closed, but its repercussions would be felt for a long time to come. For Mary's family, for Michael, for Father James, for the entire parish of St. Augustine Church. Brady knew this story would stay with him for a long time. It would be a reminder of how easily human lives can become entangled in a web of lies and innuendo, and how important it is to be honest with yourself and with others. Finished cleaning up, the detective turned off the lights in his office and went outside. New Orleans had a life of its own, noisy and colorful. Somewhere out there in that city, new mysteries, new stories were brewing. and Brady knew he would be ready to uncover them when the time came. He got in his car and drove home, leaving behind St. Augustine's church and all its secrets. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new case. But today's story would forever be a part of him, a reminder of how complex and unpredictable human relationships can be. And as Brady drove through the evening streets of New Orleans, he thought about the fact that perhaps the main mystery he'd been trying to solve his entire career was not crime, but human nature itself, with all its contradictions, passions, and mysteries.